Potion Yarns is going on the road a lot more this year to trunk shows and festivals. Alpaca my bags. See what I did there? Hey there, Fiber Junkies! Welcome back to the Color Cauldron. I'm Joanna, the owner and dyer behind Potion Yarns and host of this podcast. If you are a new viewer, thank you so much for giving me a try. I hope I didn't scare you off with my terrible joke before this video started. And if you are a returning viewer, you should be used to my terrible jokes by now, so welcome back. I'm so glad that you guys have joined me for another installment of our wool series. This has been surprisingly more popular than I was expecting. Like, I knew that people would be, I knew it was a good idea and I hoped people would be interested. I had no idea that people would be so into the wool series that I started last year in 2018, where for each installment of the wool series we take a different breed or sometimes a couple breeds, and we talk about their characteristics and what makes their wool unique and different, how to use it in projects, what you need to know if you're gonna try spinning it and things like that, and just kind of a little bit of history of how we got all these amazing different breeds of sheep all over the world and why it matters what type of wool you use, because wool is not wool necessarily. There's the generic wool, which usually means just a big mixture of a bunch of different types all together, and then there's breed specific wools, and you may need to look for a breed specific wool to get the best results out of your project. So that's kind of why I started this series, and I'm so glad that it's been really popular with you guys. We were doing them pretty hardcore for a while last year, and then I kind of got a little bit, like, I was still enjoying them, but I was needing a little bit of a break and enjoying doing some other things on the podcast from time to time as well. And in response to a survey I did with a bunch of my social media followers, people were saying they preferred a little bit more, even though they wanted the wool series to keep going, they preferred a little bit more variety and doing some different things from time to time. So we have taken several weeks break now, and then every so often I'll sprinkle in a little wool series episode here and there. And it's high time we added another one. Today's series, we're actually going to be stepping outside of our normal wool series format, and we're not going to be doing a sheep breed today. As you probably guessed from my terrible pun beforehand, we are going to be talking about alpaca, one of the most popular wools on the market today in the hand knitting industry. And yes, I absolutely did have to Google alpaca jokes before I started filming, because I was like, what can I possibly say for an intro? Sometimes I come up with a quick little pun, or sometimes I think of it while I'm talking and I say something and then add it into the beginning of the video. And today I had nothing on alpacas. I couldn't think of anything clever or funny to say, and I didn't really have any like great suggestions for an intro. And then I had this really dorky idea to like make an alpaca joke, but I couldn't think of anything. So I totally had to Google it. So yeah, that's my lame joke. And let me tell you, that was about the best one I found. There were a bunch more. I'm sure there's probably some other better ones out there somewhere, but just my cursory Google search, I found a whole bunch of alpaca jokes, and most of them were pretty lame and terrible. That was like the best of the bunch. So I'm sorry and you're welcome all at once. But today, let's talk about alpaca. So how many people here have worked with alpaca before? Me for sure, and I bet a lot of you have without even knowing it, because here's a crazy fact I unearthed while I was doing research for the alpaca series. Did you know that most commercial knitting wools, when they're just labeled as like 100% wool or something like that, or you know, wool blend, and they don't tell you breed specific, a lot of them actually have a teeny tiny bit of alpaca blended into it with the other types of wool. I did not know that, but I stumbled across this this article that was written by the owner of like a mill that processes and spins wool commercially, and she was talking about how frequently there are a lot of little leftover bits and pieces of alpaca, and there's some of the like coarser grade alpaca and things like that that they don't want to put in like fancier luxury hand knitting yarns, and so they just throw them in with all of the rest of the wool leftovers and just the mixture of generic wool. And so there's quite a bit of alpaca mixed in where you wouldn't ever know it, and it's usually like, if it's under, I think it's under 5%, or maybe it's 2%, but under 5% or 2% or something like that, they don't have to tell you like breed specific categories or anything like that. They can't just say wool, and if there's less than 2%, I think they don't even have to tell you if they put a little bit of like something else in it. So there's probably tiny little trace bits of it in a lot of the yarns that you've used before that are just labeled as wool. So we probably have all knit with it at some point or other if you've been knitting for more than a couple weeks. Or if you've ever knitted anything with wool, I suppose. If you only knit with acrylic, you've probably never experienced alpaca. But yeah, kind of an interesting tidbit. So here's a couple things that I found interesting when I was uncovering talking about alpaca. First of all, what is alpaca? For those of you who may not be familiar, first of all, are you living under a rock in the hand knitting world, because it seems like it's everywhere these days. But if you are not familiar, or if you're like, okay, I've heard alpaca, I have some alpaca yarn, I don't actually know what that is. So alpacas are part of what is called the camelid family. We all know what a camel looks like, right? Even if we've never actually seen one in person, we kind of have a general idea of what a camel is. Well, an alpaca is in the same family, but they're a different breed. So it's kind of like how dogs are actually in the same family as wolves, but they're not, like we wouldn't call like your little Jack Russell Terrier like a wolf, really. Like he's related to them, those are his ancestors, and he's in that same canine family, but we call him a dog and a wolf, right? Same kind of a thing with the camelid family. There's camels, and then there's like alpacas and llamas and vicuñas and things like that. And it's a relatively small category. There aren't that many different breeds within the camelid family. It's not like sheep where there's well over 200 breeds and growing all the time. It is a much smaller pool to choose from, but there are characteristics that they have in common. So alpacas have become the most popular of the camelid family in the modern world, but that was actually a pretty new development. For many, many years, alpacas were unheard of in like Europe and places like that, and even in America. And then once they were heard of, they were kind of like a luxury, exotic, kind of crazy fiber that you didn't get very often, and they were very, very expensive because alpacas come only from South America. So camels were found in like the Middle East and Africa, and alpacas and llamas were specifically bred in South America and are only originally from those countries. Now you can find them in other parts of the world, but originally they were only bred there. And so for many, many years, the governments in South America had very strict laws on exporting camelids like alpacas and llamas. They were very, very tightly controlling the population and trying to make sure that it was kind of like one of their national resources, and they didn't want it just being something that people could have everywhere, you know? Alpacas actually were on the endangered species list for a while, or I don't know if they were officially on the list, but they were getting close to being extinct for a while because they were, like I said, they were from South America, and they originated, we think that they've been bred specifically since about 4000 BC. So they may have existed before then, but they, like, farmers actually trying to breed them and on purpose produce these animals and like domesticate them and things happened around 4000 BC. And they became a very closely guarded secret, a very important export for or not an export, but an important resource for the South Americans. For a long time that was because South America just was a little bit, I hate to use the term wild, like not in a like derogatory sense, but like it just was a less explored land. For a lot of times it wasn't one of the older, more common civilizations like in Europe. For a while that South America wasn't even on their radar, and then even after it became that way, it was kind of like an exotic treasure to have like alpaca fiber from South America that you could bring back, and it was hard to get, expensive, and there were really strict laws governing the export for a really long time because the South American governments wanted to control the supply and therefore increase demand. But they had some problems when the Spanish conquistadors went over to South America in about, I think, around the 1500s. They for whatever reason, they had hunted some alpacas, they were taking their wool, and I'm not sure what all the reasoning was behind it, but alpacas started becoming more and more rare. And part of the reason for that is alpacas tend to have fewer babies than like sheep or something like that. They don't reproduce quite as fast. But they became in high demand for a while, and the Spanish conquistadors almost wiped them out, which we're so grateful today that they didn't, because what an incredible animal to have lost. So thankfully they were not, and then there were some strict regulations put in force by the government over time, and they were protected for a while they tried to like rebuild the populations. And during that time they really didn't want them being exported at all because they were trying to very much control it. One of the problems that you have when you start exporting animals out of the lands where they are native to is you can take them out of you know, Colorado or wherever they're from and move them to a totally different climate and locale. And sometimes the animals don't respond very well to the changes, and you can end up losing a lot of animals in the process just from dying out, not having the proper conditions. As we humans learn what conditions are best for them to grow and thrive in, sometimes animals are lost along the way. And so it can be really dangerous. So you want to make sure that you have a good population built up in their native climate before you start exporting animals out and trying to mimic the conditions as much as possible, so that you can really help these animals to grow and not end up wiping out the population. So after the population got built back up, and in the 1980s, there were a lot of I don't know if they're called farmers, but like animal raisers, animal husbandry, people who practice animal husbandry and things like that, and breeders who were wanting to really help to increase the population as well as get it into more parts of the world, because they were really trying to increase the demand for alpacas and reintroduce people to these incredible animals and get them excited about their fur and stuff, and supporting the people who were domesticating them and breeding them. And so they started all these collaboratives with South America to try and make sure that the animals were responsibly exported and raised and all of that. And so nowadays they're doing much, much better, and they're in high demand these days. The facts I found online were over 3 million animals are doing well and thriving, and those were pretty old facts. I think those were from like 2012 or 2014 or something. So I'm sure they're doing even better now, because I feel like every other person I know either has an alpaca farm or is related to someone who does, or knows someone who does, or wants to have one someday. Actually, a lot of my friends are saving up and dreaming of their alpaca farms someday, and I have a couple more that have some started. So yeah, they're getting a lot more plentiful these days, which is great because they're adorable and amazing animals. They're just really cute. They have these big round eyes that are just like really soft and adorable. They've got these like, they're just like fluffy. First of all, who doesn't love fluffy animals? They're fluffy. We already know we love their yarn and fiber to work with and craft with. And they're just so cute. And they have these like kind of goofy little faces, and they almost look like they have eyelashes. Like, they're just real pretty animals. So a big part of the reason why alpaca farming became so popular a few years ago, I'm convinced, is just because people saw these animals and were like, oh, they're so cute, I need some. But then also there was a demand a few years ago, I don't know how many years ago it was now, but I would guess a little over a decade ago, when it wasn't as popular to have alpaca farms at all the little local fiber fests and things, but people were starting to get their hands on alpaca yarn and wools and really wanting to work with it because it was amazing, and there was this opportunity, and a lot of people jumped on the opportunity and started alpaca farms, started raising them, sending it off to the mills and processing wool and yarn, or hand spinning it or whatever and selling it. And then as it grew in popularity, eventually that market kind of bottomed out. And I don't think that it's necessarily like a bad thing to get into nowadays. So if you're thinking about having an alpaca farm, I haven't done any of the number crunching or anything, so definitely go research it. But I did hear from some of my friends that are looking into it that it's not as lucrative nowadays as it was if you jumped on the bandwagon before it got really popular over a decade ago. And so it's not necessarily going to be the huge influx of cash and the great money cow that you think it's going to be. So definitely look into it if you're considering it a lot, and talk to people in the know, people who have had experience with it, as well as like accountants and things, to see if that's a good risk for you. But it is very appealing. I understand why people like the idea, although I personally would never want to raise my own fiber animals because I'm a city girl and I don't want to have to. I have enough trouble keeping track of the cats. That's plenty for me. But I'm thrilled that there are so many people that want to raise their own, because I love to buy their wool and support their farms, and I love that people are caring for their animals so well, and at least in most cases, and really promoting education about the animals and their processes to fiber crafters. So keep it up if you're one of those amazing alpaca or other animal farmers for the fiber industry. We love you guys, and we're so grateful that you will raise those animals for those of us that don't want to or don't have the money for it. So there are a couple different types of alpacas. There are two main kinds. There's Surrey, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but Hoyakaya, I think is how you say it, something like that. So the main difference is between, it's kind of like having different breeds of dogs almost. They're both alpacas, they're just kind of different types, and the main difference is in their wool. So the Surrey alpacas have like longer, curlier locks. They're like little silky ringlets. And the Hoyakaya has a denser, firmer fabric. It's still, very, very soft. And there tends to be more crimp to the Hoyakaya. It is the more common alpaca for people to find in yarn these days. So about, some of the figures I saw online is that about 80 to 90% of the alpacas that we use for like yarn and hand knitting and hand spinning and stuff are huayacayas. So that's generally what you're going to run across. But you can find Surrey alpaca on the market. There are some yarns out there like that as well. Both the types have what are called coarse beard hairs. Yes, like a man grows a beard. Beard hairs that are like shorter, coarser hairs that have to be separated out in the processing. So if you're going to buy a fleece and process it yourself, you may have to deal with that. But you're going to have to sort out those beard hairs and get them free of the longer, silkier locks that would actually be what you would want to wash and process and spin and knit or crochet with. I personally like to have someone else do all of that, even in my little forays into spinning. If you're not familiar, I do hand spin, but I have only done it on a drop spindle. Planning to try a wheel this year, but we'll see how that goes. And I love it, but I'm still very, very new at it. So I don't wash my own fleeces of any kind and do all of that. I tend to buy already washed, combed, prepared fibers and work with that instead. Although I do have a lot of locally grown and processed alpaca fleece that I am excited to try spinning with very soon. So alpaca fleece is marvelous to work with. There are a couple things that I wanted to go over with you guys. First of all, the micron count. If you have been around for my wool series before, you'll remember that micron basically means how fine or coarse the wool is, and the smaller the number, the finer the wool. So like extra fine merino tends to be like 16, 17 microns, and like Jacob sheep that are going to be more of a coarser wool tend to be more in the upper 20s. So alpaca generally has about an 18 to 26 micron count, although you can find some baby alpaca, or I believe it's called royal alpaca, that's like quite a bit more rare for hand knitting yarns, but you can occasionally find them that tend to be even under that, more in the like 14 to 16 micron count range, but those are pretty rare. Generally it's about 18 to 20, somewhere in there. But still, that's quite a fine fleece, and compared to a lot of our wool breeds we've looked at, that's still a lot softer and finer. The thing about alpaca that makes it so special is it's incredibly lofty and lightweight. So alpaca fiber, the hair fiber, has a hollow core. If you remember in some of my earlier videos when we talked about bleeding yarns and we talked about the composition of wool, some of our wool series, we talked about there being 3 layers to the hair strand generally, at least 2, sometimes 3, depending on the breed. And the inner layer of most sheep hair and human hair is going to be like the cortex and the medulla. And for alpaca, it's hollow inside that core. They don't have an inner core medulla like human hair and some sheep breeds. So that hollow core means that the hair strand is very, very lofty and light. There's all that air pocket inside of the hair strand. So that is why alpaca yarn, if you ever feel it next to like a basic wool or even like a merino, the merino will have a bit more heft to it, and the alpaca is just going to feel like if you let it go, it almost feels like it could just float away and lift up into the air. It's so lofty and light. Some of that will depend on the spinning and the preparation and how it is prepared or spun, woolen versus worsted, etc. But in general, I've found alpaca yarns almost always feel like a lot more just light and lofty and airy inside, and it's because of that hollow core. The other thing about them is alpaca fiber tends to be a really long staple length. So you can find some that are in the 3 to 6 range. That's a pretty common medium grade alpaca. But in my research, I was finding a lot of alpaca farmers were saying that their animals will often have locks that are anywhere from 3.5 to 11 inches staple length. 11 inches, that's crazy long. Most of the sheep breeds we've looked at are anywhere from like 2 to 6 inches. So that's a really, really long staple length. And the Surrey alpacas typically have a longer staple length than the huayacaya because of those longer ringlets that they have. So some of that will depend on exactly what type of alpaca you're working with. Alpaca tends to be very durable and strong, even though it's really, really lightweight. People tend to think of it as a luxury fiber. I know I do, and that is definitely true, but for being a luxury fiber, it's actually pretty strong. It has quite a bit of strength to it. It's not particularly elastic though. It generally has a pretty low elasticity, so if you're thinking about making alpaca socks, you're going to want to make sure that you use an alpaca blend, because socks need to be very elastic in order to hug your feet and to withstand all of that abrasion from walking around in on them and things like that. So you might want to use alpaca for more like laying around house socks when you're just putting your feet up on the sofa, not really walking around in shoes and standing on them all day. And or you're probably going to want to make sure that you use a blended wool so that you have alpaca blended in with something that has more strength to it, something like a stronger wool or nylon or something like that. It's not really great on its own for those types of heavy abrasion garments and things that really need to hug their shape as much. It does have some elasticity, but not super high. It does wick moisture away really nicely, just like sheep's wool. And if you're not familiar with wicking, we did talk about that a little in our Intro to Wool series last year, so you might want to go back and check that out. But also, it's basically, the short answer is, it's the ability of the fiber to not absorb water. So like if you spill a little bit on your wool sweater, it's not going to suck it up as fast as other fibers like cotton might. It's going to, wicking away is kind of like it resists that moisture. So that way wool fibers tend to be very, very comfortable for when you're sweating, like hiking socks or something like that, because they will push that sweat away from your skin, which is really, really nice. So another thing that makes alpaca a little bit different to work with than sheep's wool is its feltability. Alpaca will felt, and it actually felts really beautifully. However, it does take a little bit more time and care than sheep's wool generally to felt, because of the fact that alpaca has far fewer scales than wool does. So most sheep's wool has those scales that we talked about in our wool series already that overlap all the way down that hair strand. That's the outer layer called the cuticle. It's these overlapping scales, kind of like the tiles on a roof. And when you ruffle those up with hot water and abrasion, they stand up instead of laying down. And then as you agitate them and rub them around, they get enmeshed in each other and they create like a thick pad. That's felting. And we actually just had a video on felting a couple weeks ago, so go check that one out where I was felting slippers. And alpaca will do that. It does have scales, but it has a lot fewer scales than wool, so it can take a lot longer for those to get enmeshed, and it can also require a little bit more effort on your part to get it to felt. However, one of the cool things about alpaca is it comes in 22 natural colors, which is a really high range for natural non-dyed sheep breed wools. Most breeds of sheep will oftentimes, if they have multiple colors, a lot of times, some of them will have more variation, but a lot of times they will have anywhere from like 2 or 3 colors up to maybe 5 or 6 at the most. Alpaca comes in 22 different shades, and their white alpaca does not need to be bleached at all. It is super, super white on its own. It actually can't stand up to being bleached, so you don't ever want to bleach it. And it will felt a lot better than white wool that has not been bleached, or that has been bleached, excuse me. Most wool that is white has been bleached in order to turn it into a really, really crisp white, unless it's like an off-white or like an eggshell or something a little bit darker. It's usually been bleached a little bit to get that pure white. So, tip for felting, if you're felting with pure white wool, it's not going to felt very well for you because of the bleaching process dissolving a lot of those scales. So you'll want to make sure that you're using a not bleached wool or a dyed wool or something like that that will felt a little bit better. And alpaca, if you want something white that's like crisp white and felted, you want to use an alpaca for it, because while it will take longer, it will eventually felt, and it'll felt better than the sheep's wool that has been bleached. So a little tip for your felting, for those of you that get into felting. One really cool part about alpaca too is that alpaca does not produce any lanolin like most sheep's wools. So in sheep's wool, sheep produce a substance called lanolin, which is also known as grease, which sounds really disgusting, but it's actually just this almost like a waxy kind of substance. It feels kind of like wax or butter or something, and the sheep's skin secretes this to cover their wool, and it's basically a way of waterproofing the animals so that when they're standing out in like the rainy moors of England or something, they are not going to get soaked in. It's what helps with that wicking, but it's actually a separate thing. It can still have wicking properties even without having lanolin, so you can remove all the lanolin and it'll still wick the moisture away. But the more lanolin you have, the more waterproofed that wool is going to be. Lanolin is also really, really great for moisturizing your skin. So like farmers that work with sheep and like sheep shearing and things like that a lot will often have really, really soft hands. It has kind of a strong odor, which a lot of people don't like, although you can learn to like it. I used to hate it, and now I've learned to love it because a lot of the wools that I get are minimally processed. And so when I'm soaking them before I dye them, I kind of wash them and soak them off before I dye them. And frequently when I take them out, there will be this filmy, off-white, almost yellow-looking cast to the water. And if you put your hands in the water, it'll feel like there's like soap in it, and that's the lanolin coming off of the wool. And I remove as much of that as I can without stripping the yarn, because I like my colors to take really, really vibrant and rich, and so I need those yarns to be as clear of that as possible. And all of my yarns are superwash, so they've already been through a process that's removed a lot of that lanolin, but some of my more minimally processed ones and my non-superwash ones and things like that will oftentimes have a little bit of that. And I've noticed my alpaca yarns that I get don't have that because they don't have the lanolin. So the lanolin is not in alpaca, which makes it much better for people that have allergies. Now, there are different opinions on what causes wool allergies, and not all wool allergies, like every other type of allergy, not all wool allergies are the same. So you can't just say, because if you find out that your Aunt Sally is allergic to lanolin and that's why she can't wear wool, you can't just be like, oh great, I'll get her superwash wools or alpaca because those have no lanolin. That might work for her, but that isn't necessarily going to work for your cousin Sadie, because she might not have the same type of wool allergy. So I want to tell you to proceed with caution and be open to trying things for your friends that have wool allergies, but don't force them and be like, no, it has no lanolin, you should be able to wear it, because that's not necessarily what their allergy is to. But a lot of people that are allergic to wool will find that they can wear alpaca and alpaca blend wools because they don't have that lanolin content in them, and that is actually what their skin is reacting to. So if you're suffering from allergies, or you know someone who is, try knitting them something out of pure alpaca or alpaca blended with something like nylon that isn't going to have any lanolin either, and see if they can handle that and if it bothers their skin at all. I think a lot of the time you're going to find it's gentle enough, soft enough, and lanolin free so that it isn't actually causing any reactions. However, like I said, take it with a grain of salt. They may still have an allergy to some other type or some other part of the wool, and you will want to be respectful of people who do. We'll have a video on allergies at a later date, I think, because there's a lot more information that we could talk about there, but alpaca is good for being more hypoallergenic. Okay, so that's some really cool things. I love the fact that it comes in all the different colors, because it makes color work with undyed wool very, very fun and exciting. That is one of the things that I want to challenge myself to try in the near future as well. I bought some sport weight natural, locally raised alpacas a couple years ago at a little maker fair around here. And I bought it in a couple different colors so that I could, with the idea that I was going to make some little, like, either a hat or some fingerless gloves that had some, like, Fair Isle color work out of the undyed wool. And I still haven't done it, so I need to get around to it. But it's really easy to do with alpaca because there's so many choices to choose from. You can make really beautiful Fair Isle sweaters or hats or whatever out of them. One of the downsides to alpaca is because it is so lofty and has that hollow core and is just so like light and bright and everything, it can be a little bit easier to cause pilling, which is, I mean, we all know what pilling is, right? It's when you're, the little like fuzzy hairs that are on your sweater, you get those little balls on the end of them, and then they have those razors, you can shave them off. I don't have one of those, but I'm thinking I'm going to invest in one soon because I have a lot of old hand knits that I still love, including this sweater, but they're getting really, really pilly. So unfortunately, that does happen with alpaca. This sweater was made out of 100% alpaca years ago. I've had this for probably 6 or 7 years now, and it's a really cute pattern, if you can see in the back. It's by Vera Valimaki, but I have forgotten what it's called. So I will try to look that up and leave a link below, but you can probably see here this huge old pill hanging off. That's attractive. But it's really, really cozy, really, really warm, and it has this amazing, really cool like lace and cable panel. It's like, it's not really a cable, it's like a traveling stitch, but it mimics the look of cables that goes all the way down your sleeves and across the back of your sweater, and then you have these great stripes and these little like open front handkerchief hem fronts. I love this cardigan, and I knit it with the recommended wool in the pattern, which was alpaca, and I love how buttery soft it feels, and I've had this for years and years, and I wear it all the time, so it gets a lot of use, which is why it's looking a little ratty. But it still feels extra, extra soft and cozy and luxurious. But the yarn that I used had a little bit of a halo. So we haven't talked a ton about halos on here before, but basically if we say yarn has a halo, that means that when you look at the strand of yarn, there's a little bit of like a fuzzy, almost like a cloud around it. I think of like Pigpen in the Peanuts comic strip, that little guy that always has the dirty cloud around him. It's like that, only a halo isn't dirty, it's just extra soft. Think of it like really furry, fluffy yarn, or like angel wing yarn or something. If it has a halo, generally it's extra soft. So I love yarns that have a little bit of a halo, and then there are ones like the mohair lace weight that's really, really popular, and a lot of indie dyers have it in their shops these days, including me. I just added some. Mohair that's really popular right now, the really popular yarns have the really fuzzy surface. That's a really heavy halo, or a very, very large amount of fuzz on the surface. But ones like this don't really have a big halo, but there is a little bit of fuzz on them. And so that fuzz can make it more prone to pilling, especially I get a lot right here where the arm rubs against the side of my body. I get a lot of pills right there on this sweater because you got those haloed surfaces rubbing against each other and it creates little pills. So I need to invest in one of those razors. That is one of the downsides of Alpaca and one of the reasons why you would not want to choose it for certain projects, especially if they see a lot of abrasion. I love Alpaca blends best when I'm working with like luxury sweaters or even socks occasionally, things like that. My Jolie sweater, which I have shown on the podcast before, I've worn it before, it's a pale pink little pullover that just has a stockinette body and a little lace yoke, and it is one of my absolute favorite pullovers that I wear because it's lightweight and super warm, because it is made with a 50-50 blend of alpaca and superwash blue-faced Leicester, which unfortunately was discontinued, so I can no longer stock it in my shop, which I'm very sad about because it was one of my favorite yarns. It was amazing. But it's really, really lightweight, but it's one of my warmer sweaters because of that 50% alpaca content. The alpaca has a little bit of a halo, so it's got a little bit of like a fuzzy, cozy feel, but the superwash blue-faced Leicester, which blue-faced Leicester is more of like a medium wool, it really kind of helps to balance it out, and it makes it less prone to pilling. It makes it have a bit more elasticity and stretch. It hugs my body really nicely while still having amazing drape. Which is another thing alpaca is known for, is having great draping qualities. So alpaca is phenomenal in shawls or any kind of like lace work or something like that. It's also fabulous for blankets because it's lightweight and warm and fuzzy. Who doesn't love a great fuzzy blanket? So alpaca really is super versatile, considering that it is actually considered more of a luxury wool. It does need a little bit of firmness added to it for a lot of fabrics. So if you need something to hold its structure or its shape a little bit better, you're definitely going to want to use an alpaca blend. Blend it. One of the most common ones is just to blend it with other types of wool, either like a mixture of just generic wool or a superwash merino or a superwash blue-faced Leicester, something like that, to give it a bit more structure while still leaving it very, very soft and luxury for next to your skin wear and things like that. Some of the best stitches you can use for alpaca. So you can use any stitch for alpaca, really. You can do it on literally anything, colorwork, lace, etc. But you do want to keep in mind what your overall project is, how it's going to be used or washed, and whether or not you want to cut out the halo that alpaca has, etc. So one of the things that you need to keep in mind is for stockinette stitch, alpaca has a very strong tendency to be irregular and uneven and tilt a bit on the bias, so that if you're knitting like a square of stockinette, it might have a bit of a tilt after a little while, where the stitches kind of like slide a little bit, or it can just be really irregular and uneven. It's not great for projects that you need to be super, super even across. I would do something like a superwash merino or something if you need it to be really, really even stitch work in your stockinette. So alpaca tends to do a bit better when you have a bit of structure added to it. This makes it awesome for like textured stitches where you're mixing knit and purl patterns, twisted stitches or traveling stitches. Cables are amazing in alpaca, but you do want to keep in mind that if you are doing ribbing, like a 1x1 ribbing or a 2x2 ribbing, because alpaca doesn't have much elasticity, it's not going to be the type of ribbing that will give you like a really big stretch and then hug back to its original shape, like for socks. It's going to be mostly a decorative ribbing if you do that. So I have some ribbing here on my cuffs of my sweater. It looks awesome, but like it doesn't like hug my hand. It's not one of those cuffs where you've got like the tight cuff at your wrist and you can stretch it out to get your whole hand really wide in there, but it snaps back to your wrist. It's not like that. It's more of a decorative. So when I was knitting this sweater, I think I just stuck with the same needle size and I didn't decrease any stitches or anything. I may have even gone up one needle size for the cuff because it doesn't, or excuse me, I mean down one needle size, because it doesn't hug in at all. And so you want to make sure that you are aware of that when you go into your project and you're not counting on that ribbing being the thing that holds up your knee-high sock or something like that. But it looks great in ribbing, it looks great in texture. It does look lovely in lace, although it does need to be blocked pretty aggressively usually when there's lace involved. But again, that will kind of depend on whether or not you're using a blend or 100% alpaca, what type of alpaca, and what type of stitch work and needle gauge and all of those things. But that gives you a lot of variety for your stitches. Okay, for the final section to talk about alpaca, I just want to give you guys a few quick tips in case you're wanting to try this for your hand spinning. Now keep in mind, every time I talk about spinning on this podcast so far, I don't talk about it a ton, and when I do, it's very little snippets here and there, and that's because I'm just not very experienced myself. So I do look up information when I can online. I talk to other spinners who are way more experienced. I look at other things that people are saying online about it from their experiences, and I take that with a grain of salt and deliver it to you as best as I can. But a lot of this is just me going off of hearsay and research other people have done, not my own personal experience. I am working with alpaca in my spinning, but I've only done it a little bit, and again, only on a drop spindle. However, I do have a few tips for you if you're wanting to hand spin alpaca. The first thing is you can spin it woolen or worsted. If you don't know what that means, you're probably not a spinner and you don't need to worry about it too much. I am planning to do a video on that in the future, but it's going to be a little bit before we get to that one. But for you spinners, you should already know what that means. So you can do woolen or worsted, but it really depends on the outcome overall. Alpaca tends to do a little bit better worsted spun if you are wanting it to behave a little bit more like a commercial yarn, or if you're wanting more versatility out of your yarn. However, it is absolutely stunning when it is spun woolen, as long as you do the preparations properly, and as long as you know that you really want to use it for something that isn't going to see a lot of abrasion, and that you want that really light, fluffy, fuzzy, loftier kind of a feel. If that's going to work well for you, like a really cloud-like cowl would be amazing in a woolen spun alpaca, or a really cozy little snug winter hat or something. Those would be amazing spun woolen, but you don't want to spin it woolen if you're not sure what you're going to do with it. In my opinion, when I'm not sure what I'm going to do with my hand spun, I try to do it in the most versatile way possible, and in this case with alpaca, I would think that would be worsted. Now I could be wrong, you could have your own opinion, and if so, I'd love for you to leave a comment and tell me what you think about that, because I am still learning a lot about spinning, but that would be my, my choice for it. The other thing that I wanted to mention with spinning is you definitely want to make sure that you are taking a lot of extra care when you are joining your yarn. So as you're spinning, and let's say like the fiber breaks, or you're joining in a new braid or something like that, where you join that yarn, you're going to want to take extra care to make sure that you really do a good job of getting a tight, even join, because if you don't get it joined properly, alpaca tends to be more slippery than a lot of sheep's wool, and it tends to have looser twist, and so it will kind of break apart at those joins if you're not taking extra care to make sure that they're a really solid, even join. So you want to be a bit more careful with your alpaca for hand spinning than you would with a lot of the wools that are a bit more forgiving of beginners. So if you're a beginner, I'm not going to tell you you shouldn't do alpaca, because I think that's kind of like telling a beginning knitter that they shouldn't try doing lace or cables. Like, screw that. If they want to do lace or cables, let them do lace or cables. Not everyone learns at the same rate or in the same way. So like when I was first starting out knitting, I didn't start with lace or cables, but it wasn't very far along my journey before my mom taught me how to cable, and shortly after that, I taught myself how to knit lace, and I started knitting these intricate lace shawls and blocking them, and my mom was like, "You just started. How are you doing that? You should have waited a few years before you tackled that." And I was like, "No, I just wanted to learn it now." So I'm not going to tell you you can't spin alpaca if you're picking up the spindle for the first time this week. Go for it. You can do it if you really want to, but in my opinion, it would be a little bit better and a little bit easier and less frustrating to learn starting on a bit more of a forgiving, more basic wool or something until you get the hang of your spindle or your wheel and you feel a little more confident. But what do I know? I hope you guys have really enjoyed this video. I hope that if you have never tried alpaca, you are inspired to go look for some. There are a ton of blends out there. I actually have some 100% alpaca in my Mad Science lab right now on my website. That is the section of my shop where I put in bases that I'm testing, new colorways that I'm trying out, or oopsie skeins, or things that a lot of times I try a new colorway and I'm like, that's pretty, but I could make it better if I just tweaked this one little thing. So I'll put just that batch in the Mad Science Lab and sell it off, and then I'll recreate the colorway in a better version, and that'll go in my regular shop. Things like that, sales, oopsies, one-of-a-kinds, etc. And I've got some 100% alpaca in there right now, and from time to time I will bring in alpaca blended yarns. I don't have any in my main baseline that I have all the time, but I am bringing in a few at a time to just play around with. So keep an eye on the shop, because we'll probably have more alpaca blends coming to the shop soon that you can try out. They are really phenomenal when they're blended with other things. My favorite blends are blended with a superwash merino, a superwash blueface Leicester, or another type of softer wool. A lot of times a 50-50 blend is really great for that, or you can do like 80-20 or something. And then I also really love it blended with nylon for a sock yarn, just a little bit of nylon, like 25% or less. I had one last year in one of our yarn clubs. We tried a skein that was superwash merino, alpaca, and nylon, and it was a sock yarn, and it was absolutely stunning. It took the dye beautifully. It was so fabulous, and it was strong enough for socks, but soft enough and luxurious enough for a real cozy sweater, and it was just so much fun to play with. So keep an eye out on the shop, and I may have some more coming in the future. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Please leave me a comment below and let me know what you loved about the podcast. Let me know if you have ever raised alpacas, worked with alpaca yarn, or if you want to try it. If you did work with it, did you like it or not, and what did you like about it or not? And let me know any other ideas you have for things you want to see on the podcast in the future, or any questions that you have, and I'll do my best to answer them or make a future video about them. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you have a great week. It is now time to cast off. Love you.